Assalamu alaikum, brothers and sisters. This is brother Ijaz Ahmad of Calling Christians and MAP, the Muslim Apologetics podcast. Back in March of 2018, just a few months ago, I had a dialogue with Ijaz Smith, and at the 1st of August, he released a new video basically summarizing his previous videos on his new YouTube channel. What I've noticed in his new video is that he's begun to walk back claims or correct himself based on the dialogue I had with him. But he continues to make really big mistakes, and today I'll just highlight a few of them based on his latest video.
More than that, he had a secretary named Zaid ibn Thabit. Why didn't he write it down? Isn't that what secretaries are supposed to do? These are all the questions we brought up, and of course we asked them in the second episode.
Well, Jay, allow me to answer this question for you. I'm reading from the book published by Dar es Salaam. It's titled The Biography of Imam Zaid ibn Thabit, and it is written by Salahuddin Ali Abdul Mawjud. On page 66, it is written, Walid ibn Abu Walid reported that Sulaiman ibn Kharija ibn Zaid narrated from his father on the authority of his grandfather, who said, whenever the revelation came to Allah's messenger, blessings and peace of Allah be upon him, he would send for me and I would write it down. So in this narration, this is Zaid speaking, and he specifically says that he would write it down. It's reported in the same book on page 79. Al-Hakim reported in his book Al-Mustadrak on the authority of Zaid ibn Thabit, who said, we were with the messenger of Allah, blessings and peace of Allah be upon him, compiling the Qur'an in pieces of cloth.
But for now, we just looked at that one and we asked the questions when it was written, and we quoted two scholars, Altıkılıç and Ekmel Nisanoglu. Tahir Altıkılıç, Dr. Tahir Altıkılıç and Dr. Ekmel Nisanoglu, both from Turkey, who both had access to the Topkapi. They were the ones that were responsible for the Topkapi. They've had the best work on it, and they were the ones that came out with their report.
So this is Ijaz Smith in August of 2018. He appeals to Dr. Tayyar and Dr. Esangulu as scholars, and he pretends as if he uses their scholarship for his positions. But when I questioned him in March about their conclusions, he completely disregarded their research. He is not a scholar in the field. He does not do textual criticism. His PhD is on a biography of a Christian missionary in India. Let's just get that clear. So in August of 2018, he says, yes, I love these guys, they're great scholars. I use their research for my statements. But when I specifically questioned him on what their conclusions were, he rejected their scholarship. So which is it, Jay?
So Dr. Altıkılıç is saying it's the same. He points out orthographical differences, and based on your own scholarship, you disagree with his authority. Is that correct?
Listen, I'm going to disagree with him, obviously, because you're not going to hear what I'm saying. And listen to what I quote. When you look at the Topkapi is a mid-8th century man.
Hold on, Jay, let's work this out. Let's do simple math. 622 CE is when the Hijri calendar begins, agree?
Right. And goes to 719.
Hold on, add 50 years, what do you get?
And goes to 719.
Hold on, add 50 years, what do you get? You get 672.
So let's just clarify something here. We're trying to clarify the date from which the dating can begin. So the Turkish scholars wrote from the second half of the 1st century Hijra. So a century is 100 years. You split them up into 50 years to get two parts. The first 50 years are the earlier part, the second 50 years are the later part. The scholars are saying, these two Turkish scholars are saying that the dating begins from the second half of the 1st century. So we're looking at the year 622. This is the year that the Hijri calendar starts. You add 50 years to that, and that covers the first half of the 1st century. So 622, add 50 gives us 672, which means that the dating for the Topkapi manuscript begins, it's a range, it begins at 672. And then you add 50 years to that, and it takes you to the year 722. What J. Smith wants to avoid saying is that the date begins in the year 672. Why does he want to avoid that early date? Because that puts it within the 1st century Hijra. You'll notice he also made another mistake, and that is, in the earlier version, he says it's mid-8th century. Mid-8th century will give us the year 750. Then he changes and he says, no, it's 719. That's a difference of almost 30 years. So in the same discussion I'm having with him, he gives me 2 different dates, drastically different dates, and he refuses to acknowledge that it can be within the year 670 onwards.
It goes to 719. It goes to 719. It goes to 719. The top copy is a mid-8th century man. It goes to 719. The top copy is a mid-8th century man. It goes to 719.
Al-Taqulij and Ihsanuddin both said that this was written in the second half of the 1st century up until the first half of the 2nd century, so about 670 up to 770. The end of the 7th century, the first half of the 8th century.
It goes to 719. The top copy is a mid-8th century man.
This was written in the second half of the 1st century up until the first half of the 2nd century, so about 670 up to 770. This was written in the second half of the 1st century up until the first half of the 2nd century, so about 670 up to 770. So basically, we're talking about the early 8th century up until the mid-8th century. This was written in the second half of the 1st century up until the first half of the 2nd century, so about 670 up to 770. So basically, we're talking about the early 8th century up until the mid-8th century. I know some Muslims would like to go to 670 and start with that date, but that's not what they're saying. You don't start with the earliest date, you start with the median date. This was written in the second half of the 1st century up until the first half of the 2nd century, so about 670 up to 770.
We now begin our detailed analysis, and to do so we must first begin with some questions towards Mr. Smith. The first question is, where did Dr. At-Taqulaj or Dr. Ihsanuddin mention a median date? I have looked at their manuscript, I have looked at the document itself, published in 2007, and I am unable at this point in time to find any mention of, or concept of a median date. So when you mention that this is not what the scholars say, then what do they say, and how do you make the claim that this median date comes with authority from them? We move to the second question. Where did anyone claim 670 was anything other than the start of the date range? I have always maintained and asked him why he always rejects or excludes the 7th century as part of the date range. And I have maintained that 50 years after the beginning of the Hijra, which is the year 622, so we end up with the years between 670 to 672 as the start of the date range for which the top copy manuscript can be dated. And so I am asking Mr. Smith, where was any other claim than this made? Thirdly, I ask him, how did you get the date range of 720 to 750? This date range is not mentioned by any of the scholars, specifically not mentioned by Dr. At-Taqulaj or Dr. Ihsanuddin. I have looked at their manuscript, by this I mean the document that they produced in 2007, and I am unable to find this date range. To examine Mr. Smith's date range, we are going to actually look at a comparison of the dates given by those scholars. And when we look at those dates, we come up with a very significant problem for Mr. Smith. The date range he has given is not evidenced by what the scholars themselves have said. It almost seems as if it's an arbitrary date to push the dating further away from the 1st century Hijra. That means He is not giving us this date with pure objective intentions. It seems arbitrary, subjective, and biased. In order to do a detailed analysis, I've had to create a timeline, a chart with relevant dates being spoken of. That is to help us better visualize the data so that we can have a comprehensive understanding.